Hey guys, tonight we walk into a much older world than the one your school textbooks usually let you linger in, a world of ember, light, wind over grass, and human footprints pressed into damp ground, long before cities, kings and neat timelines. You can almost feel the smoke in your hair and the chill at your back, while someone nearby watches the dark and listens for movement beyond the fire. We're exploring the true origin of humanity, but gently and carefully, because some parts are widely accepted, history, some parts are interpretation, and some parts are calm. What if imagination? Archaeology suggests a lot, historians debate quite a bit, and a few popular theories may sound exciting while still resting on very thin evidence. You probably won't survive this version of prehistory without a jacket, decent shoes, and an attitude adjustment about bedtime. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're listening from somewhere cozy, post your location and local time in the comments. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You begin as the mainstream evidence most strongly suggests in Africa. Most historians agree that our species, Homo sapiens, first emerged in Africa, with fossil and archaeological evidence placing early modern humans there long before they spread across the rest of the world. The evidence we do have points to a deep layered story rather than a single dramatic morning when someone stood up and announced, "Well, congratulations. Everyone, humanity has started." Evolution is usually much less theatrical than that. It tends to be slow, messy, and full of overlap, like a group project where nobody agrees on the deadline, and somehow it still changes the planet. Archaeology suggests that by hundreds of thousands of years ago, different human species and populations were already adapting to varied landscapes across Africa and beyond. What's broadly accepted is that Homo sapiens developed traits we recognise as anatomically modern over time, and then cultural complexity continued to deepen in ways that are harder to measure neatly. Bones can tell you a lot, but not everything. A skull can hint at shape and age and injury. It cannot tell you who told the best stories by the fire, who sang off key, or who kept borrowing the good scraper and never returning it. And this is where the gentle mist begins. One interpretation is that the earliest myths humans later told, much later in villages and cities, may preserve emotional memories of life in deep prehistory, not as literal records, but as echoes. If we treat that as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it becomes a useful way to think, not a claim that every legend is a secret documentary. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. We'll keep the solid ground separate from the mist. You sit near that imagined fire now, not because we can prove exactly what was said there, but because the setting itself is plausible. Night falls fast, sparks rise, someone points upward, the stars are sharp, unpolluted, almost rude in their brightness. A child asks a question, an elder answers with a story. It's possible that this habit gathering facts and meaning together is one of the oldest human technologies of all. What if the story is pointing at something else? Not aliens, relax. We are still on page 1. What if the first great human invention is not a spear point or a basket weave, but shared attention? The ability to sit together and build a world in words. A careful reading might suggest that long before writing, long before monuments, the human mind is already practicing memory theatre. You remember where the water is, you remember which plants may heal and which ones may ruin your week. You remember who is kin, who is trusted, who once tried to pet the wrong animal. This is not mystical. This is survival with narrative seasoning. Historians still argue whether the biggest leap in human success came from individual intelligence, language, complexity, cooperation, or some shifting blend of all three? That debate matters because it changes how you imagine your beginning. If the answer is mostly tools, then human origin feels like engineering. If the answer is mostly social cooperation, then human origin feels like relationship. If the answer is symbolic thought, then your beginning carries a little poetry in it from the start. A more cautious explanation could be that all these threads braided together over long stretches of time, varying from place to place, group to group, season to season. That's less dramatic than a single hidden trigger, but honestly, it is often how real history works. A fringe idea proposes that ancient humans inherited advanced knowledge from some lost civilization at the very dawn of time. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it stays popular because it gives the past a sudden spotlight and a secret staircase. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. In this case, the evidence is very thin. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. Early humans do not need a vanished superteacher to be impressive. They already are. Surviving changing climates, dangerous animals, illness, injury, and each other while raising children and sharing food is not exactly beginner mode. And still, even with the mainstream picture, the atmosphere remains mysterious in the best way. You hear dry grass moving in the dark. You smell ash skin, earth, and something roasting that may or may not be cooked enough by modern standards. You look up and see the stars turning overhead, and without clocks or maps or apps calmly rerouting you around traffic, the sky becomes both calendar and question. Archaeology suggests that attention to seasons and landscapes was essential very early on, and one interpretation is that wonder itself may have helped sharpen memory and teaching. That's a possibility, not a certainty, but it fits the scene like smoke fits cold air. Let me rephrase that more carefully. Wonder did not replace evidence. Wonder may have travelled alongside practical knowledge, helping communities remember what mattered. You don't survive by daydreaming alone, but you also don't become fully human in the richest sense by facts alone. You survive by combining observation, trust, caution, and imagination. In other words, you are part scientist, part storyteller, and part exhausted person trying to make it to sunrise. So tonight, as we begin at the fire rather than at the throne or temple, we stay with what's broadly accepted while allowing the edges to breathe. Africa stands on solid ground in the evidence. The spread of humans comes later. The debates are real. The myths are echoes, maybe. The cinematic glow is ours for now to help you feel the scale of it. We're not proving anything tonight. We're following clues. And the first clue is simple. Before humanity built empires, wrote laws, or argued online about ancient mysteries at 2 a.m, you sat under a sky full of lights and asked where you came from. You leave the fire at first light with smoke still clinging to your hair and the ground cold under your feet, and you begin to move. Not in a straight line, not with a flag, not with a dramatic soundtrack. Just step by step across changing land as generations of humans slowly spread outward from Africa into new climates, coastlines, valleys and seasons. Archaeology suggests this movement happened in waves over long stretches of time, with pauses, detours and returns, which is much more believable than a single heroic march led by someone named something like Trail Boss Supreme. Most historians agree that Homo sapiens dispersed from Africa and gradually populated much of the world. Though the timing, routes and interactions vary by region and remain an active area of research. The evidence we do have points to multiple migration pathways rather than one neat arrow on a classroom map. Some groups likely travelled along coastlines, some inland, some through corridors that opened and closed as climates shifted. Sea levels rose and fell, grasslands expanded and shrank, rivers moved. What looks fixed on your modern map was often a temporary arrangement. One interpretation is that some migration routes may have followed shorelines now submerged by later sea level rise. A careful reading might suggest that parts of the human journey are literally underwater, which is less a conspiracy and more an inconvenience of geology. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it helps explain why the archaeological record can feel patchy in coastal zones. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. You can picture it without turning it into fantasy. A family group moves near a coast because food is there. Shellfish, perhaps, fish birds, plants, fresh water if they're lucky. Children complain, elders carry memory. Someone watches the tide line and notices where storms bite chunks out of the shore. You do not know that tens of thousands of years later the sea may cover this place entirely. You only know where supper might be and where not to sleep if the wind changes. Historians still argue whether certain early migrations happened earlier than once believed in some regions, especially as new finds and new dating methods refine old assumptions. That phrase matters here because migration stories tend to get oversimplified into certainty. In reality, archaeology suggests a pattern of expanding evidence and revised timelines. A site appears, a date is tested, another lab checks, scholars continue to debate. Then sometimes a familiar story gets nudged by a few thousand years, which, in prehistoric terms, is basically a polite scheduling adjustment. To be clear, this is debated and the details differ by continent, but the overall picture remains strong. Humans spread widely, adapted repeatedly, and kept moving. What's broadly accepted is that climate played a major role. Glacial periods and warmer intervals reshaped landscapes and opened or closed routes over time. A more cautious explanation could be that migration was rarely driven by one cause alone. Population pressure, curiosity, seasonal movement, social ties, conflict, and opportunity may all have mattered. Human beings are very good at having multiple reasons for doing one thing, including reasons they themselves would struggle to explain while carrying a child and a bundle of tools in the rain. And then there is the coastline question, that soft cinematic edge where evidence fades into possibility. A fringe idea proposes that there were committable vast advanced coastal civilizations at the dawn of humanity whose traces were swallowed by the sea. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it often grows from a real observation lower sea levels in the distant past exposed land that is underwater today. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. We do not have solid proof of some global super civilization hidden beneath the waves. What we do have is a reasonable possibility that ordinary human camps, pathways, and settlements in now submerged coastal areas may be underrepresented in the record. That is already mysterious enough. What if the story is pointing at something else? What if the lost world people imagine is not a lost empire with impossible machines, but thousands of modest places where real humans cooked, argued, mended tools, taught children, and watched the horizon? A broken shell pile, a hearth stain, a path worn into old ground. These things rarely survive as dramatically as stone monuments, but they may have mattered more to daily life than any later king's inscription. Archaeology suggests migration was also a story of adaptation. You move into colder lands and learn new clothing strategies, shelter forms, hunting patterns, and seasonal timing. You move into forests and your senses change. You move into open plains and distance becomes part of your thinking. One interpretation is that the human mind itself may have been shaped not just by genes over deep time, but by constant cultural improvisation, by solving local problems with shared memory. That's a possibility, not a certainty, but it fits what broadly accepted anthropology often shows flexible humans outperform rigid systems. You feel this in the small details. Sand underfoot one season, frozen mud another, salt on the air near the coast, the smell of damp hides drying over smoke, the sound of a child repeating place names until they become the group's map. There is no printed atlas. There is no GPS voice saying rerouting in a calm tone while everyone ignores it. There is only observation, repetition, trust, and enough caution to avoid turning every hill into a bad decision. A popular rumour claims ancient maps or legends secretly preserve exact global migration routes from the beginning of time. This might support the idea that memory can travel far, but as a literal claim, it is suggestive, not conclusive. Most historians agree that oral traditions can preserve important cultural memory, sometimes for surprising lengths of time, yet linking a specific later story directly to a specific Ice Age route usually requires more evidence than we have. We'll keep the solid ground separate from the mist. Still, as you continue outward with humanity, the scale grows almost dreamlike. Continents that now feel separate become chapters in one long walk. The evidence we do have points to endurance so ordinary and so immense that it almost looks mythical when you zoom out. Not because someone hid the truth from you, but because the truth itself is bigger, slower, and harder to fit into a simple slogan. You keep moving. Shoreline, river, ridge, plain. Some paths vanish. Some survive in genes, tools, and stories. And somewhere behind you, the first campfire questions are still glowing, while ahead of you the sea keeps one hand over parts of the trail. You keep moving until the journey itself starts to feel normal, and then almost without warning, the story shifts from where you are to what you can do with your hands. The path is still there under your feet, but now your attention settles on the object in your palm, the edge of a stone flake, the weight of a hammerstone, the small decision of angle and force that turns rock into a useful tool instead of a disappointing chunk. Archaeology suggests toolmaking stretches far back before Homo sapiens and continues through many human groups, which is your first reminder tonight that human progress is not a tidy staircase built by one species alone. Most historians agree that stone tools developed over very long periods, becoming more varied and specialised in different places and times. What's broadly accepted is that these changes reflect skill planning, teaching, and adaptation to local needs. The evidence we do have points to gradual development with regional differences, not a single global moment when everyone woke up and suddenly invented competence. That may disappoint the fans of dramatic origin montages, but it makes the real story richer. You crouch near a work area, maybe by a stream where good stone can be found, and watch someone shape a core. Tap, turn, tap, pause. Another strike sharper now. Flakes scatter. A child watches from the side and tries not to get in the way while absolutely getting in the way. This scene is mundane, but it contains something extraordinary repeated knowledge. A technique exists in more than one mind. That means teaching. That means memory outside the body. That means culture doing quiet work in the background. One interpretation is that apparent bursts of innovation in the archaeological record may reflect moments when social networks expanded, allowing ideas to spread more efficiently rather than sudden changes in raw intelligence. A careful reading might suggest that creativity often looks sudden only because preservation is patchy and our evidence arrives in fragments. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. A site survives here, another erodes there, and your timeline ends up looking like a blinking light rather than a steady glow. Historians still argue whether major leaps in tool complexity were driven more by cognitive change, population density, environmental pressure, or cumulative cultural learning. That debate matters because it shapes the entire mood of human origins. If innovation depends mostly on genius individuals, then the past becomes a gallery of rare minds. If innovation depends heavily on social learning and population links, then the past becomes a web, and your species succeeds, not because one person is brilliant, but because many people share enough information before winter arrives. A more cautious explanation could be that these factors interact differently in different times and places. Human history loves mixed causes. It is basically a stew, and every attempt to reduce it to one ingredient makes it taste worse. Archaeology suggests that later toolkits include not only stone points and scrapers, but also evidence of composite tools, adhesives, hafting, and planned sequences of production. Most historians agree that this reflects increasing complexity in how tasks were organised. You are no longer just holding a sharp edge. You are imagining the handle, the binding, the repair, the future use, the next hunt, and the person who will borrow it and return it covered in something suspicious. Tool-making becomes foresight made visible. And here, as always, the mist creeps in around the edges. A fringe idea proposes that certain prehistoric technologies appear too advanced for their age and must come from a lost source of knowledge. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it persists because people sometimes underestimate how much patient trial and error can achieve. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. In many cases, extraordinary craftsmanship does not require hidden teachers from a vanished super-civilization. It requires time repetition, community knowledge, and incentives such as not starving. What if the story is pointing at something else? What if the truly hidden leap is not a secret machine or forbidden blueprint, but the social habit of correction? Someone shows you a method. You try. You fail. They adjust your grip. You try again. This might support the idea that human progress depends as much on teaching patience as on discovery itself. It's possible that the most revolutionary prehistoric technology is not the stone blade, but the phrase, "no like this." Let me rephrase that more carefully. We cannot directly hear those lessons, and we should not pretend to reconstruct exact conversations from stone flakes. That's a possibility, not a certainty. But archaeology suggests patterned manufacture, and patterned manufacture usually implies shared technique. The evidence we do have points to repeated methods being transmitted over time. You feel the rhythm of this section in your body, palm against stone, dust on your skin, the tiny sting when a flake nicks your thumb because you were overconfident for half a second, the scrape of hide, the smell of smoke and mineral dust. In that rhythm, human origins become less like a mystery poster and more like a workshop, slow, noisy in small ways, full of concentration, occasionally interrupted by somebody wandering off with the best tool and claiming they were just borrowing it. A popular rumour claims ancient myths about divine gifts of craft literally describe outside beings delivering advanced technology to early humans. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, we can still ask a useful question. Why do so many cultures honour teachers, smiths, tricksters, or culture heroes associated with skill? One interpretation is that societies personify the frightening brilliance of technique itself. Firestone metal weaving, counting writing later on. Skills can feel magical when you don't yet know the steps. Most historians agree that no single artifact reveals the complete origin of humanity, but tools help because they show repeated choices. They reveal planning, correction and adaptation, all the slow habits that make your species resilient. The evidence we do have points to hands and minds shaping each other over deep time. You make tools, and tools make new behaviour possible, and new behaviour changes what future humans can imagine. So as you leave the work area and rejoin the path with flakes glittering faintly in the dust behind you, you carry more than a sharpened edge. You carry a pattern. And in human history, patterns often matter more than single moments, even if single moments make better thumbnails. You carry that pattern with you into darkness again, and this time the darkness is not just a campsite beyond the fire, but a cave wall, breathing cool air against your skin. The smell changes first, damp, stone, old mineral smoke drifting inward, and the faint animal scent that lingers in places used across seasons. Your footsteps soften, flame light flickers across uneven walls, and suddenly the stone is no longer only stone, it holds lines, shapes, marks, animals, hands, movement caught in pigment and shadow. What's broadly accepted is that prehistoric cave art and symbolic markings reveal minds already capable of abstraction, planning and shared meaning. Most historians agree that humans in multiple regions created symbolic art body, ornamentation and markings long before written history. Archaeology suggests these practices were not decorative in any simple modern sense, even if beauty surely mattered too. The evidence we do have points to intention. Pigments were gathered and prepared. Surfaces were chosen. Some images were placed deep inside caves far from daily sunlight. That alone tells you something important. Nobody hauls pigment and flame into a dark stone tunnel by accident because they got bored and took a wrong turn on the way to dinner. You raise the lamp or torch a little and the wall seems to move. A bison shifts with the curve of stone. A horse stretches mid-stride. A handprint blooms red against rock like a message from someone who never expected you specifically to arrive and stare at it in your pyjamas, thousands of years later, and yet here you are. Archaeology suggests many of these images were made with skill and intention, sometimes layered over long periods. One interpretation is that certain caves may have functioned as memory spaces, teaching places, ritual sites, or storytelling chambers. That's a possibility, not a certainty, but it helps explain why image, place, and repetition seem to matter together. Historians still argue whether specific cave motifs were primarily ritual, instructional, territorial, narrative, or some blend of all four. That exact debate is one of the most fascinating parts of this chapter, because it reminds you that symbolic life leaves traces but not subtitles. You can see the mark. You can date pigments and charcoal in some cases. You can compare styles. But you cannot simply press play and hear the original explanation. A more cautious explanation could be that meanings varied by community and changed over generations just like symbols do now. Even modern people can't agree on what a group chat emoji means half the time, so expecting perfect prehistoric clarity may be ambitious. Still, the mainstream anchor is strong. Most historians agree that symbolic behaviour is central to what we recognise as fully modern human culture, even if the timing and form differ from place to place. The evidence we do have points to planning depth, social learning and imagination. A careful reading might suggest that cave art is not merely evidence of art in the modern gallery sense, but evidence of minds coordinating memory, attention and shared stories. What if the story is pointing at something else? Not hidden laser projectors in the Paleolithic cave ceiling. We are staying calm. What if these painted walls are early libraries, not because they contain alphabetic text, but because they store information in image, location and ritual repetition? If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, then the cave becomes less a mystery shrine and more a cognitive tool. The path inward matters. The order of images matters. The sound of the chamber may matter. Archaeology suggests some caves have acoustics that react strongly to voice or percussion in certain areas, and one interpretation is that sound and image could have worked together in memorable ways. This is suggestive, not conclusive, but the idea is hard to ignore once you imagine torchlight echo and painted form all in one place. A fringe idea proposes that cave images encode advanced astronomical maps or secret messages from a lost global civilization. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it survives because some patterns do invite comparison and because humans are excellent pattern-finding machines, especially when tired and staring at dots. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. In many cases, direct claims of exact star maps go beyond what the data securely supports. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. That does not make the caves less wondrous. It may make them more human. You imagine a child being brought into the chamber for the first time, eyes wide, trying to stay brave. You imagine an elder explaining an animal, a season, a hunt, a warning, a story of ancestors, or perhaps something we no longer have words for. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. We'll keep the solid ground separate from the mist. But even on solid ground, the cave already tells you this: humans are making meaning together on purpose in durable form. And the hands, those handprints keep returning to your mind. Most historians agree that hand stencils and prints in prehistoric contexts are among the most immediate human marks we possess. The evidence we do have points to presence and performance, to the act of marking itself as meaningful. A popular rumour claims these hands are coded signatures from an elite hidden order preserving forbidden knowledge across ages. A more cautious explanation could be simpler and somehow more moving. People mark walls because being present matters, because memory matters, because someone wanted to say, in the only durable way available, we were here. Let me rephrase that more carefully. We cannot know the exact intention behind each handprint. That's a possibility, not a certainty. But archaeology suggests repeated symbolic acts, and repeated symbolic acts usually belong to social life, not random doodling while waiting for your friend to finish sharpening a spear. As you leave the cave, blinking at daylight, the outside world feels slightly changed. The same wind moves through grass, the same path stretches ahead, but now you know your species is not only walking and tool making, you are storing memory in symbol, carrying stories in image, and building meaning in places where stone outlasts flesh. The wall holds the trace, the fire carries the story. And somewhere between those two, humanity begins to look unmistakably like itself. You step back into open air with cave cool, still clinging to your skin, and for a while the world feels wide again. Wind over grass, distant birds, the usual business of staying alive. But slowly, almost quietly, the rhythm changes. The seasons stop feeling like weather you endure and start feeling like cycles you watch. You notice where seeds fall. You notice what grows back. You notice which places reward patience and which ones punish it. And in that long noticing, the human story begins to pivot toward one of its biggest transformations. Archaeology suggests agriculture emerged in multiple regions over time, not as one magical invention, but as repeated experiments in different landscapes. Most historians agree that farming developed independently in several parts of the world, including Southwest Asia, East Asia, Mesoamerica, and elsewhere, though the crops' timelines and pathways differed. What's broadly accepted is that this transition took generations and involved a mix of gathering, cultivation, storage, herding, and adaptation. The evidence we do have points to a gradual shift rather than a single grand announcement, where someone in a field declared, "Congratulations, we have invented chores forever." And yes, that is basically what happens. You move through a village edge in your mind, now not yet a full city, but no longer only a camp. There are tools set aside for digging and cutting. There are baskets pit stored grain, maybe animals nearby, whose habits are becoming part of your planning. Smoke rises from hearths in a steadier pattern. Children grow up in a place people intend to return to or remain in for longer periods. Time starts to feel less like a wandering path and more like a cycle with obligations attached. Archaeology suggests that climate changes near the end of the last ice age created shifting opportunities and pressures in many regions. One interpretation is that communities did not simply discover farming all at once, but move through long periods of mixed strategies, adjusting as environments changed. A more cautious explanation could be that farming was sometimes attractive, sometimes risky, and often deeply local. That's a possibility, not a certainty, but it matches the evidence better than a dramatic one-day revolution. Historians still argue whether agriculture spread mainly because it was a clear improvement in daily life, or because in some contexts it became the least bad option under changing conditions. That debate matters because modern people often imagine farming as obvious progress. More food, more people, more permanence done. But the evidence we do have points to trade-offs. Farming may support larger populations and more storage, yet it can also increase labour social hierarchy, disease exposure in denser settlements, and dependency on a few staple crops. In other words, human history once again refuses to behave like a simple motivational poster. Most historians agree that domestication of plants and animals happened through long relationships between humans and landscapes. Archaeology suggests selective pressures, repeated harvesting, and management practices gradually changed species over generations. You are not just finding food now, you are shaping future food. And future food very rudely now expects planning. What if the story is pointing at something else? What if the real revolution is not seeds in soil, but time becoming scheduled? If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, then agriculture is also a psychological shift. You begin to live inside calendars, planting windows, harvest timing, storage seasons, animal cycles, debt of labour to future meals. A careful reading might suggest that settled life trains the mind toward delay, accounting inheritance, and eventually administration. The field becomes a clock before the clock exists. This is where the section starts to feel both ordinary and uncanny. You can hear grinding stones. You can smell chaff and smoke and damp earth after light rain. You can feel sore hands and a back that has opinions about your life choices. Someone is sorting seeds with extreme concentration. Someone else is explaining for the 5th time why you do not eat the seed grain. A child asks why. An elder gives the look every generation learns to recognize. Civilization in one tiny scene. A fringe idea proposes that agriculture appeared suddenly because advanced beings or a lost civilization handed early humans farming knowledge. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it remains popular because domestication can seem astonishing when viewed from far away. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. In this case, the mainstream archaeological record strongly supports gradual experimentation and local development over long periods. No hidden agronomy seminar required. Still, mystery does not vanish. It changes shape. A popular rumour claims ancient stories of culture heroes bringing grain or farming tools prove forgotten historical visitors. This might support the idea that communities remembered major transitions through mythic figures, but as literal evidence it is suggestive, not conclusive. One interpretation is that societies often personify difficult innovations in memorable characters because stories travel better than instruction manuals. And honestly, if you had to convince exhausted people to commit to years of field labour wrapping, the message in sacred drama probably helped. Let me rephrase that more carefully. Myth can preserve emotional truth about a transition without serving as a literal documentary account of who introduced which crop in which valley. That's a possibility, not a certainty. We'll keep the solid ground separate from the mist. What's broadly accepted is that agriculture, once established, changed settlement patterns, social organisation, and eventually power structures. The evidence we do have points to storage leading to ownership questions, ownership leading to rules and rules, leading to people who become very interested in telling everyone else what the rules are. You can probably see where this is going, and yes, cities are warming up in the wings. But for now, stay in the field a little longer, watch hands move through grain, listen to insects in the heat, feel the patience built into every task. Human origins are no longer only migration and memory painted on stone. They are also waiting, tending, preserving, and gambling on tomorrow. And if you listen closely, beneath the soft scrape of tools and the hush of wind through stalks, you can hear something new entering the story, the sound of time being organised. You hear that organised time long before you see the walls, because settled life develops a new kind of soundscape. It is not only wind and birds and footsteps anymore, it is grinding, stacking, calling, bargaining, hammering animals penned too close to where people sleep, smoke rising from many hearths at once, and the constant human miracle of trying to coordinate large groups without anyone losing their temper. Then the city comes into view, not all at once, but in layers. Mud brick edges, storage areas, workshops, temples or communal structures rising above smaller dwellings, paths becoming streets because too many feet have chosen the same route. Most historians agree that some of the earliest cities emerged in places like Mesopotamia alongside developments in irrigation administration, trade, and organised labour. What's broadly accepted is that urban life did not appear everywhere the same way, but where it did emerge, it transformed how people worked, worshipped, and understood authority. Archaeology suggests these early cities were dynamic systems, not just bigger villages. The evidence we do have points to scale changing everything. You can feel that change in your body. In a camp, you know most faces. In a village, you know families. In a city, you start recognizing roles before names. The potter, the scribe, the labour gang supervisor, the priestly official, the person who somehow controls grain access and suddenly speaks very slowly, as if patience itself were a tax. Urban life introduces complexity, and complexity introduces management, and management introduces stories about why some people should stand on platforms while others carry baskets. Most historians agree that early kingship and formal authority developed gradually, often intertwined with religion, war leadership, and control of resources. One interpretation is that later myths about divine kings and culture founders may preserve memories of social upheaval when old community structures gave way to centralized power. That's a possibility, not a certainty, but it helps explain why so many origin stories of cities feel half administrative record and half cosmic theatre. Historians still argue whether early states formed primarily through cooperation and coordination, or through coercion, conflict, and unequal control of surplus. That debate matters because it changes the mood of the city. If you emphasize coordination, the city looks like a brilliant machine for collective survival. If you emphasize coercion, it looks like an elegant trap built out of grain accounts and walls. A more cautious explanation could be that both are true at once, depending on time, place, and who is telling the story. Cities feed people and bind them. They create specialization and hierarchy. They produce art, law, trade, and bureaucracy, which is a very polite word for everybody needing to write down who owes what. Archaeology suggests that urban centres in Mesopotamia and elsewhere were linked to surrounding farmland and trade routes, meaning the city is never really a separate world. It is a knot in a larger network. You smell river mud, baked brick, wool, oil, smoke and sweat. You hear animals, tools chanting children, and someone arguing over measures of barley like the fate of the universe depends on it. To be fair, for dinner, it might. What if the story is pointing at something else? What if early city myths about gods granting kingship or order are not hidden proof of supernatural rulers walking the streets, but narrative ways of making unstable systems feel permanent? If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, then myth becomes political architecture. A careful reading might suggest that when societies grow too complex to be held together by kinship alone, stories help create legitimacy. This order is sacred is a very effective upgrade from please cooperate. A fringe idea proposes that the first cities were designed under the guidance of a vanished advanced civilization whose knowledge was later forgotten. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it remains popular because early urban achievements can seem startlingly sophisticated when viewed from a distance. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. In this case, the mainstream evidence strongly supports local development through accumulated knowledge in irrigation, construction, labour organisation and trade. Human beings, given enough time and pressure, are fully capable of inventing cities on their own and then immediately complaining about traffic in donkey form. Still, the mystery remains, just in a more grounded shape. The evidence we do have points to city life changing human identity itself. You are no longer only defined by family and season. You may now be defined by craft district temple affiliation ruler or administrative obligation. One interpretation is that urbanization helped create new scales of belonging and anxiety at the same time. That's a possibility, not a certainty, but it fits the pattern many historians recognize in later societies too. The bigger the system, the more stories people need to explain their place in it. A popular rumour claims that ancient king lists with long reigns prove a forgotten era of superhuman rulers. This might support the idea that memory and prestige distorted chronology in ways communities found meaningful, but as literal evidence, it is suggestive not conclusive. Most historians agree that ancient lists often mix political memory, symbolism, and ideology. Let me rephrase that more carefully. They may preserve real names and traditions while still being shaped to communicate legitimacy rather than modern-style accuracy. We'll keep the solid ground separate from the mist. And here in the city's glow at dusk, your origin story gets another layer. Humanity is not only the species that migrates, paints caves and plants fields. You're also the species that builds systems bigger than any single person can fully see. Streets carry grain from farms you never visit. Walls are repaired by hands you never meet. Rituals are performed on behalf of strangers. Power accumulates in rooms you are not invited into. Civilization is magnificent, practical, and occasionally suspicious in ways that feel very familiar. You move through the crowd as lamps are lit, hearing the city hum like a living thing. Somewhere a story is being told about how this order began, who granted it, who protects it, and why it must continue. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. But the city itself is real, and with it comes a new human question, one that will follow us for thousands of years. Not only where did we come from, but who gets to tell the origin story now? You feel that question following you out beyond the city walls, past storage yards and canals and fields, into the open places where weather still speaks louder than officials. The city keeps records, yes, but the land keeps older memories in a different way. A river rises too high and rearranges everything. A storm comes at the wrong season, a shoreline shifts. Villages move, fields fail, boats vanish. Then years later, someone tells the story to a child by a lamp and says the waters came so fast the world itself seemed to end. And just like that, the human archive splits into what was measured and what was remembered. Most historians agree that many cultures preserve flood stories, and archaeology suggests that local or regional flood events were common enough in river valleys and coastal zones to leave deep marks on collective memory. What's broadly accepted is not a single worldwide flood as a settled historical fact, but a recurring pattern of communities living with destructive water and then preserving those experiences in mythic form. The evidence we do have points to the emotional truth of disaster memory, even when the stories later grow in scale, symbolism and drama. You can picture the scene because it does not require fantasy to be frightening. Rain that does not stop, riverbanks weakening, mud walls softening, animals panicking before humans understand why, someone trying to move grain sacks to higher ground while somebody else insists the water always recedes by morning. It doesn't. By dawn the path is gone, the markers are gone, and the familiar world has become a mirror of brown water and floating debris. You survive maybe, but the place you knew does not survive in the same shape. One interpretation is that repeated flood narratives across cultures may reflect both shared human experience and the way stories travel along trade and migration routes. A careful reading might suggest that some tales preserve local memories while others borrow motifs and structure from neighbouring traditions. That's a possibility, not a certainty, but it matches how stories usually behave. Humans are excellent at exchanging goods, tools, songs, and dramatic plot lines. Historians still argue whether specific ancient flood traditions are best understood as records of particular environmental events, literary inheritance, moral storytelling, or layered combinations of all three. That debate is not a weakness in the story. It is the story. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. We can identify flood-prone environments. We can study river systems, sediment layers and settlement shifts. We can compare texts and oral traditions. But drawing a straight line from one flood story to one exact prehistoric event often asks more precision from the evidence than it can give. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. And yet the repetition of flood motifs still matters. Most historians agree that when many societies preserve similar themes of destruction and renewal by water, it tells you something important about human vulnerability and memory. What's broadly accepted is that water both sustains and threatens settled life, especially after agriculture and urbanization. A more cautious explanation could be that flood myths endure not because they hide a single secret event, but because they fit a recurring human reality. Everything feels permanent until water moves the boundary. What if the story is pointing at something else? What if flood myths are also memory technology? If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, then exaggeration becomes a feature, not a flaw. A story grows larger so the warning survives. Build higher, store grain differently, listen to elders, watch the river, respect the season. One interpretation is that myth can carry practical caution inside cosmic language, especially in societies where formal records are limited or controlled by elites. That's a possibility, not a certainty, but it explains why stories that sound supernatural can still preserve very earthly lessons. A fringe idea proposes that all major flood stories are fragmented evidence of a single lost global civilization destroyed in one cataclysm. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it remains popular because it offers one grand answer to many scattered puzzles. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. While there may have been major regional disasters and rising seas after the Ice Age, the mainstream evidence does not support a confirmed single global advanced civilization erased in one event. This raises the possibility that the real pattern is more human and more complex. Many communities, many floods, many retellings. You feel this complexity in the little details that stories preserve. A basket sealed with pitch, animals gathered in panic, a boat improvised, a hilltop crowded with survivors, the smell of wet grain turning sour. The silence after the rain finally stops. These are not always literal records, but they are not empty either. Archaeology suggests settlements in floodplains repeatedly rebuilt after inundation, and the evidence we do have points to resilience as much as destruction. Humans do not just remember disaster. They remember how to start again, often with less sleep and more mud than anyone wanted. A popular rumour claims ancient flood stories hide maps to buried pre-flood vaults of knowledge. This might support the idea that people intuitively connect loss with hidden treasure, but as evidence, it is suggestive, not conclusive. Let me rephrase that more carefully. Communities may preserve tales of what was lost because loss itself organises memory, not because every loss points to a literal underground archive waiting for a dramatic reveal. Though, admittedly, if there were a prehistory storage room labelled important stuff, humanity would probably still lose the key. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. We'll keep the solid ground separate from the mist. The solid ground here is strong enough. Ancient people lived with unstable water, and flood memory travelled through story. The mist is what we do with the scale, the symbolism, and the longing for one final explanation. As night settles and the river quiets, you sit again near a lamp and listen to a flood story told in a voice that makes the room still. Maybe it happened exactly here. Maybe it happened far away and arrived by trade. Maybe it carries warning grief, prestige theology all at once. Human origins are not only bones and tools and seeds now, they are also shared fear shaped into story and story shaped into survival. You carry that river memory with you into a very different kind of archive. One hidden not in mud brick walls or cave pigment, but in your own cells. For most of human history, ancestry was told through names, clans, myths, and the occasional relative who insists the family line includes a king, a saint, and someone who definitely invented soup. Then modern genetics arrives and quietly rearranges the conversation. What's broadly accepted is that DNA evidence has transformed how we understand human ancestry migration and interbreeding, sometimes confirming older models and sometimes forcing careful revision. Most historians agree that human origins are now studied through a combination of archaeology, fossils and genetics, and archaeology suggests that the strongest picture emerges when these fields are read together rather than treated as rivals. The evidence we do have points to a deeply braided human past. Not a straight line, not a pure line, a braided one. That matters because once DNA evidence expanded, especially ancient DNA studies, it became increasingly clear that Homo sapiens did not simply replace every other human population in every place without contact. In some regions, there was interbreeding. You can feel how strange and intimate that is at the same time. The story of humanity, which can sound abstract in museums and documentaries, suddenly becomes family level. Ancient encounters leave traces carried into living populations. A fragment of ancestry survives in immune responses, adaptation, and inherited variation. The past is not only beneath your feet, it is also in part within you. Most historians agree that non-African populations today carry Neanderthal ancestry in varying small amounts, and some populations also carry ancestry from other archaic human groups, such as Denisovans. The evidence we do have points to multiple episodes of contact and mixing. One interpretation is that human success may have depended not only on migration and invention, but also on biological exchange during encounters in new environments. That's a possibility, not a certainty in every detail, but it is a major shift from the older cartoon version of prehistory, where everyone lived in separate boxes and then vanished on schedule. Historians still argue whether certain population turnovers in prehistory were driven mostly by climate, disease, technology, social organisation, or complex mixtures of all four. That debate matters because DNA can reveal relatedness and admixture, but it does not automatically explain motives, emotions, or social dynamics. Genetics gives you structure. It does not give you the entire screenplay. A more cautious explanation could be that different encounters unfolded in different ways across thousands of years, exchange conflict, coexistence, avoidance, kinship, and all the messy possibilities in between. Human beings have always been complicated even before writing was invented to make the complications official. And then there is the missing branch, feeling the part that draws people toward the grand theories. A fringe idea proposes that every gap in the fossil or genetic record hides a forgotten master race or lost superior human lineage that secretly shaped civilization. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it remains attractive because gaps are uncomfortable and mystery can feel easier than patience. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. In this case, the mainstream evidence does not support a hidden superior lineage directing known human history from behind the curtain. This raises the possibility that the real surprise is not hidden purity, but deep mixture. What if the story is pointing at something else? What if the emotional shock of modern ancestry science comes from how badly many people want a simple origin, one clean tree, one pure line, one final answer. But archaeology suggests and genetics supports a much more human picture. Branches split, reconnect, vanish, and leave traces. A careful reading might suggest that the mystery of origin is not who was secretly in charge, but how many different populations contributed pieces to the story before memory, myth, and politics simplified it later. You can picture the scene in a calm, grounded way. Different groups meet at the edge of a forest or a valley crossing. They do not arrive with labels like in a textbook. They arrive as people with tools, habits, fears, food preferences, and opinions. Some encounters fail. Some lead to exchange. Some leave descendants. We cannot know the exact conversations. That's a possibility, not a certainty. But the evidence we do have points to contact that mattered. A popular rumour claims ancient traditions about giants or mysterious ancestors directly record extinct human species in exact historical detail. This might support the idea that unusual encounters can echo in long memory, but as a literal one-to-one claim, it is suggestive, not conclusive. Most historians agree that myths blend symbolism, identity, fear, prestige, and imagination, and while it is tempting to map every legend onto a fossil category, the fit is rarely that neat. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. Let me rephrase that more carefully. Myth and genetics can both illuminate the human past, but they operate in different ways. DNA can reveal biological relationships. Myth can reveal meaning, memory, and worldview. If we treat each on its own terms, they can sit beside each other without one pretending to be the other. We'll keep the solid ground separate from the mist. What's broadly accepted is that human ancestry is more tangled than earlier models suggested, and that this does not weaken the story, it strengthens it. The evidence we do have points to adaptability, interaction, and survival across shifting climates and landscapes. Humanity did not emerge as one isolated thread descending in perfect clarity. It emerged through time, contact loss, and persistence. You move on now with that thought settling gently in the background, like the sound of water in the dark. Your origin is not less meaningful because it is mixed. If anything, it may be more honest. The old question remains, but it changes shape. Not only where did you come from, but how many meetings, crossings, and forgotten branchings made it possible for you to be here at all. You move forward with that braided ancestry still quietly humming in the background, and the landscape begins to change again, this time rising into stone shadow and ambition. The path leads toward monuments, toward the kinds of structures that make modern people stop, squint, and immediately decide someone must have cheated. A platform rises where no platform should be. A chamber aligns too neatly. A block sits too heavily. And suddenly the internet in your mind starts shouting before you even arrive. But let's arrive calmly. Most historians agree that ancient monuments were built by human labour planning and skill, even when the exact methods for every detail remain debated. What's broadly accepted is that monumental architecture appears in many societies for many reasons: ritual, burial, power display, calendrical function, social cohesion, and political legitimacy. Archaeology suggests these projects required organisation, food, surplus specialised knowledge, and repeated labour over long periods. The evidence we do have points to systems, not miracles. That may sound less thrilling than a hidden intervention, but if you have ever tried to get 5 people to agree on a dinner plan, the idea of coordinating thousands for stonework is already astonishing. You stand at the edge of a monumental site in your mind now. Heat radiates from stone. Dust hangs in sunlight. Ramps, sledges, ropes, levers, teams, foremen, craftspeople, ritual specialists, cooks, water carriers, record keepers. The monument itself can look eternal, but the process is deeply human and full of logistics. Someone is measuring. Someone is cursing softly because a block shifted wrong. Someone is arguing over timing. Someone else is absolutely taking credit for work done by 20 other people. Civilization once again feels familiar. Most historians agree that the pyramids of Egypt, for example, were built in the context of state power, religious belief, and highly organised labour, not by mythical outsiders. Archaeology suggests worker settlements, tools, inscriptions and construction evidence support this mainstream view. One interpretation is that the sheer scale and precision of such monuments can create the illusion of impossible knowledge when seen from far away in time, especially after the everyday infrastructure that supported them has vanished. That's a possibility, not a certainty for every monument everywhere, but it helps explain why legends bloom in the gaps. Historians still argue whether certain alignments or design choices in ancient monuments were primarily practical, symbolic, astronomical, or layered combinations of all three. That debate is where the section becomes interesting without becoming reckless. A more cautious explanation could be that monuments often serve multiple functions at once, and meaning changes over time as later generations reinterpret them. A structure can be technically practical, politically useful, and cosmologically meaningful without requiring a secret master plan, whispered from the stars. Human societies are perfectly capable of building things that are both useful and dramatic. Frankly, we still do it now, just with more glass and parking issues. And yes, here come the legends. A popular rumour claims that ancient monuments were built by lost super civilizations, giant beings, or external visitors because ordinary humans could not have managed the engineering. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it remains popular because scale is emotionally persuasive. Big stone makes people underestimate patient labour. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. In many cases, claims of impossible construction skip over documented quarrying, transport workforce organisation, and incremental methods. This is suggestive, not conclusive when applied to every site on Earth, but the mainstream explanation is often much stronger than the rumour admits. What if the story is pointing at something else? What if the recurring urge to assign monuments to hidden teachers reveals a modern discomfort with ancient human competence? If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, then the mystery is not who secretly built this, but why we so often struggle to believe that organised labour, time and cultural obsession can produce astonishing results. A careful reading might suggest that the real hidden force behind monuments is not advanced lost technology, but social will. That social will has a cost, of course. Most historians agree that monumental construction reflects power as much as imagination. The evidence we do have points to taxation, labour, obligations, authority, and ideology playing major roles. One interpretation is that monuments are frozen arguments about order, who commands, who serves, what lasts, what matters. That's a possibility, not a certainty in every case, but it fits the pattern of many early states. Stone becomes memory, and memory becomes politics. You feel it in the sensory details: chisel rhythm, rope strain, dust in your throat, the smell of sweat-wet fibre stone chips and sun-baked earth. A worker drinks quickly and goes back. A supervisor checks measurements. A priestly figure watches a ritual moment at dawn. Children stare at the rising shape and grow up, assuming this is simply part of the horizon. The monument, which will later inspire theories and thumbnails, begins his work. A fringe idea proposes that giant myths in various cultures preserve literal memories of oversized ancient builders who raised megaliths. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it can still be read usefully if we stay careful. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, one interpretation is that giants may symbolize ancestors, former peoples, extraordinary rulers, or simply the overwhelming scale of old constructions. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. Let me rephrase that more carefully. Mythic language can preserve ore without serving as engineering documentation. That's a possibility, not a certainty. We'll keep the solid ground separate from the mist. Archaeology suggests many monuments were embedded in broader landscapes of roads, quarries, settlements, water systems, and ritual routes, much of which erodes faster than the headline structure. The evidence we do have points to monuments as visible peaks of larger social worlds. When those supporting worlds fade, later observers see the peak and imagine magic. Sometimes that says less about the builders and more about the missing context. As evening light slides across stone and shadows lengthen, you realize human origins are no longer only about survival and memory. They are also about scale, about the moment your species learns to organize labor, belief, and time into forms meant to outlast flesh. Whether temple, tomb, platform, mound, or ceremonial complex, the message is similar. We were here and we wanted the future to notice. You leave the monument behind with dust still in your throat and sunlight lingering on stone, and the path narrows into a quieter kind of power. Not the power of walls or height, but of marks, scratches pressed into clay ink on reed or bark signs, repeated in rows, until memory no longer has to live, only in the body. What's broadly accepted is that writing systems emerged in several regions for practical and ritual purposes, often tied to accounting, administration, and authority, long before they became everyday literature. And once that happens, the human origin story changes again, because now the people in charge can start filing it. Most historians agree that early writing in places like Mesopotamia, Egypt, China, and later elsewhere developed in local forms suited to different languages and needs. Archaeology suggests some of the earliest surviving written marks were connected to counting goods, tracking labour, and managing storage. The evidence we do have points to administration as a major driver. Human beings invent symbolic systems to tell stories, yes, but apparently we also invent them to count grain and make sure nobody forgets how much barley they owe. Civilization stays very on brand. You picture a dim room near a storehouse or temple complex, cooler than the street outside, with clay tablets stacked to dry or bundled records set aside. A scribe sits cross-legged or on a low seat, stylus in hand, shoulders slightly tense from repetition. The marks come quickly practiced. Numbers, names, measures, deliveries, offerings, lists. What looks to you like mystery from a museum case may have felt at least some days like office work with better hats. Most historians agree that writing did not instantly replace oral tradition. What's broadly accepted is that for long periods, spoken memory and written record coexisted, overlapped, and influenced one another. One interpretation is that writing first served institutions more than communities, which means many people's lives remained unwritten even as states became increasingly documented. That's a possibility, not a certainty for every region, but it fits the evidence in many early complex societies. The first archives may preserve power very clearly while preserving ordinary experience only in fragments. Historians still argue whether the earliest written narratives reflect existing oral traditions faithfully, or whether they were reshaped heavily by elite institutions, scribal training, and political needs. That debate matters because the moment writing appears, history feels more solid, but solidity can be deceptive. A text looks authoritative simply because it sits there in neat lines. A more cautious explanation could be that written origin stories, king lists, and sacred traditions often mix memory ideology and administrative interests. The evidence we do have points to writing as a tool, and tools always take the shape of the hand holding them. A king commissions one version, a temple preserves another, a local storyteller still whispers a third by the fire outside the walls. What if the story is pointing at something else? What if the first histories are less mirrors of truth and more stage lighting? If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, then writing is not only preservation but selection. A careful reading might suggest that what gets written down early is often what institutions need to stabilise labour taxes, ritual legitimacy, and succession. That does not make the texts useless, it makes them human. They preserve information and priorities together. Archaeology suggests early writing systems were embedded in broader administrative worlds. Seals, storage jars, weights, measures, property markers, and distribution records. The evidence we do have points to writing growing out of systems of trust and mistrust at scale. You no longer only know what happened because your aunt remembers it. Now a tablet says so. And if the tablet says so, good luck arguing, especially when the tablet belongs to the temple. A popular rumour claims ancient texts contain hidden, perfectly preserved accounts of humanity's true origin that modern scholars deliberately suppress. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it persists because damaged text, translation gaps, and poetic language leave room for imagination. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. In many cases, ancient texts are fragmentary, context dependent, and open to interpretation, but that is not the same as a coordinated cover-up. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. One interpretation is that origin myths written by early civilizations may preserve older oral material while also reshaping it to suit temple theology or royal ideology. That's a possibility, not a certainty, and historians debate the degree case by case. Let me rephrase that more carefully. A text can be both ancient and edited, meaningful, and political, poetic, and strategic. Human beings rarely miss the chance to improve a story in their own favour, once writing gives them the option. A fringe idea proposes that certain creator myths are encoded scientific records from a lost advanced age, hidden in symbolic language. This theory isn't widely accepted, but if we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it can still prompt a useful question. Why do origin stories so often sound layered, as if they carry memory from different times? A more cautious explanation could be that oral tradition accumulates motifs over centuries, and scribes later fix one version while traces of older meanings remain. This raises the possibility of deep cultural layering without requiring a vanished global archive of secret engineers. You can feel the transition physically: clay under fingernails, stylus tapping, reed fibres, lamp smoke staining beams overhead, the dry click of tablets being stacked, outside donkeys and traders and children and dust, inside marks becoming memory in a new form. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. We'll keep the solid ground separate from the mist. What's broadly accepted is that writing changes power because it changes memory. It can extend administration, preserve ritual, standardize law, and shape identity across generations. The evidence we do have points to a turning point in the human story. Once origins can be written, they can also be curated. And from this point on, when you ask where humanity came from, you are not only asking the past, you are also asking who held the stylus. You keep walking with that image of the stylus in mind, because once writing begins to organize memory, the human story expands in a new direction at the same time. Records travel, and so do people. Grains, metals, dyes, livestock rituals, marriage customs, military tactics, gods with renamed faces and words themselves move across roads, rivers and sea lanes. The origin of humanity starts to look less like a single line and more like an inheritance passed through crowded marketplaces. What's broadly accepted is that empire trade and long-distance exchange have mixed populations and ideas for thousands of years, often far more deeply than later identity myths like to admit. Most historians agree that ancient empires and trade networks connected regions across Africa, Asia, Europe and beyond in shifting patterns, and archaeology suggests these connections move both goods and people. The evidence we do have points to interaction as a constant feature of complex societies. Even groups that imagine themselves isolated usually were not. Somebody was arriving with tin shells, horses, cloth, spices, stories, mercenaries, or marriage proposals. Sometimes all in one caravan, which sounds exhausting but very on trend for history. You can picture a port first because ports make the point quickly. The smell hits you before the view fully opens. Salt tar, wet rope, fish grain dust, animal dung, smoke and perfume, trying bravely to compete. Languages overlap in the air. A dock worker shouts, a clerk counts crates, a traveller gestures wildly, because nobody here understands his exact dialect, but everybody understands urgency. Children grow up hearing more than one accent. Priests observe foreign offerings. Local cooks experiment. Somebody complains that outsiders are ruining everything, which is one of humanity's oldest international traditions. Most historians agree that identity in the ancient world was often layered, contextual, and politically shaped rather than fixed in the modern national sense. One interpretation is that many communities balanced local belonging with broader imperial or trade identities depending on circumstance. That's a possibility, not a certainty in every region, but it helps explain why ancient labels can be slippery when read through modern expectations. You can be from one city, serve another king, worship a regional deity, speak two languages, marry into a third tradition, and still insist you are being perfectly consistent. Historians still argue whether identity in many ancient societies was more fluid in daily life than elite texts and later narratives suggest. That debate matters, because origin stories are often used to decide who counts. If identities were more mixed and adaptive than later, myths claim, then pure beginnings become harder to defend. A more cautious explanation could be that people in the past experienced both flexibility and boundaries at once. There were real distinctions, loyalties, exclusions and hierarchies. But there was also exchange, assimilation, translation and blending. The evidence we do have points to a world that is neither total harmony nor sealed compartments. It is contact with consequences. Archaeology suggests trade routes were not only channels for luxury goods, but also highways for technologies and habits. Crops move, metallurgy spreads, decorative styles shift, administrative methods travel, Religious symbols are adopted, adapted, and reinterpreted. One interpretation is that human origin, in cultural terms, is always being rewritten by encounter. That's a possibility, not a certainty if stated too broadly, but it fits the long pattern of societies, learning from neighbours while claiming they invented everything themselves. What if the story is pointing at something else? What if the deepest argument over human origins is not about fossils at all, but about belonging? If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, then many later claims of pure descent or untouched tradition may be less about evidence and more about political comfort. A careful reading might suggest that people often create simpler stories of origin when the real past is too mixed, too entangled, or too inconvenient for power. A fringe idea proposes that similarities between distant ancient cultures must prove a single hidden world empire or secret ruling lineage behind early civilization. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it remains popular because parallels can feel uncanny. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. Similar motifs can emerge through contact-independent invention or broad human patterns of symbolism and social organisation. This raises the possibility of a connected ancient world, in many cases, without requiring one invisible headquarters managing everyone from a mountain bunker. You feel the truth of mixing in small things. A bead style copied locally from imported designs. A recipe changed by one new spice. A personal name borrowed from a prestige language. A household shrine holding symbols from more than one tradition. The evidence we do have points to ordinary people participating in cultural exchange long before philosophers wrote essays about it. Human history is often transformed in kitchens, docks, workshops, and marriage negotiations before it appears in royal inscriptions. A popular rumour claims every major civilization secretly traces back to a single chosen people whose records were later erased. This might support the idea that communities preserve prestige myths to explain sudden success, but as literal evidence, it is suggestive, not conclusive. Most historians agree that civilizations emerge from local development plus exchange, not from one hidden bloodline carrying all wisdom from place to place. Let me rephrase that more carefully. Elite lineages matter in specific contexts, but they do not explain the whole human story. Farmers, labourers, merchants, craft workers, sailors, translators, and migrants are carrying history too. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. We'll keep the solid ground separate from the mist. The solid ground here is crowded and fascinating. Humans have been mixing ideas, people, and practices for a very long time. The mist enters when we try to compress that messy inheritance into one clean banner. As twilight settles over the port and lamps begin to shine in warehouses and homes, you realise the question of origin has widened again. It is not only where humanity began, but how humanity keeps becoming itself through contact. The road, the river, the harbour, the caravan track, the border crossing, the translation mistake, the borrowed prayer, the marriage feast, the trade dispute. All of it belongs to the story. And the more you look, the harder it becomes to believe in a past that was ever truly sealed. You keep that crowded port behind you, but its noise lingers in your ears as the path thins into a quieter, harsher lesson. Not every skill survives. Not every system carries forward in a straight line. A kiln cools and no one rebuilds it the same way. A workshop burns. A trade route fails. A migration breaks a chain of teaching. A specialist dies and takes a method with them. Then centuries later, someone rediscovers a technique and calls it innovation, while somewhere in the dark of history, an older version smiles wearily and says, yes, we had that, and then we lost it. What's broadly accepted is that human history includes repeated cycles of loss, adaptation and reinvention. Most historians agree that technological and cultural development is uneven, with advances appearing disappearing and reappearing in different forms across time and place. Archaeology suggests collapse events, climate stress, war, migration and political fragmentation can interrupt systems that support complex production and knowledge transfer. The evidence we do have points to fragility inside progress. This is not a failure of humanity, it is one of humanity's defining conditions. You can feel it in the material world immediately. A workshop district, once active, now silent, except for wind. Broken moulds under dust. Storage jars cracked and reused for something less ambitious. A canal silted in. A road no longer maintained. A script still visible on stone, but no longer widely read. Civilization often looks permanent when viewed from inside it, and then history arrives with weather, economics, conflict, or bureaucracy, and reminds everyone that permanence is mostly branding. Most historians agree that so-called collapse is often more complicated than total disappearance. One interpretation is that many collapses are regional reconfigurations where institutions fail or shrink, while people adapt, move, merge, and continue in altered forms. That's a possibility, not a certainty for every case, but it is a useful correction to the dramatic image of an entire world switching off overnight. A more cautious explanation could be that what looks like collapse from a palace archive may feel on the ground like disruption followed by improvisation. Historians still argue whether major societal collapses were driven primarily by climate change, political overreach, inequality, external conflict, disease, or interacting combinations of all five. That debate matters because every generation is tempted to choose one cause and turn it into a warning poster. The evidence we do have points to systems failing through multiple pressures that compound over time. A drought matters more when storage is unequal. Conflict matters more when trade is fragile. Disease matters more when people are displaced. Human history behaves like woven rope. When enough strands fray together, the whole thing suddenly looks as if it snapped for no reason. And in those breaks, knowledge gets weird. Archaeology suggests some techniques are lost, not because they were impossible, but because they depended on social infrastructure, training lineages, stable supply chains, patronage workshops, and demand. One interpretation is that legends of wise ancestors or golden ages may preserve memory of real periods when communities had access to skills later disrupted. That's a possibility, not a certainty. But it helps explain why stories of the old masters recur so often across cultures. Sometimes the old masters are mythologized. Sometimes they were just highly competent people with functioning institutions. What if the story is pointing at something else? What if progress is less a rising line and more a field of campfires? Some flaring bright, some going out, some relit from embers carried by migrants. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, then lost knowledge becomes both less magical and more profound. A careful reading might suggest that human continuity depends not only on invention, but on maintenance, teaching, and boring systems that nobody praises until they fail. Yes, this is your reminder that civilization may rest on spreadsheets, storage jars, and one overworked apprentice. A fringe idea proposes that every ancient lost technique proves a vanished global super-civilization whose knowledge later societies only partially recovered. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it thrives because genuine discontinuities in the record feel dramatic. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. In many cases, mainstream explanations involving local specialisation, trade, breakdown and social change fit the evidence far better than a single hidden source. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. Still, there are moments where the silence is haunting. A script no longer read. A building method no longer replicated exactly. A pigment recipe altered because one ingredient source is gone. The evidence we do have points to memory living in people and institutions as much as in objects. Once the chain breaks, objects remain, but methods fade. This raises the possibility that many ancient enigmas are simply the shadows cast by interrupted teaching. A popular rumour claims secret brotherhoods preserve complete ancient knowledge through every collapse and still guard it today. This might support the idea that some crafts and texts were indeed transmitted through restricted lineages in certain periods, but as a universal claim, it is suggestive, not conclusive. Most historians agree that preservation is patchy, decentralised, and often accidental. Let me rephrase that more carefully. Some knowledge was protected, a great deal was lost, transformed, or independently rediscovered. Human memory is resilient but not perfect. You can smell damp stone in abandoned corridors, ash in old hearths, mould in a storehouse whose roof failed 2 generations ago. Then in another place, you hear a hammer ring again. A new workshop opens. A technique returns in altered form. A traveller shares a method. A child learns faster than the teacher expected. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. We'll keep the solid ground separate from the mist. What's broadly accepted is that humanity survives not by uninterrupted brilliance, but by repeated recovery. You lose tools, roots, texts, institutions, and still keep going. You forget and relearn. You inherit fragments and build with them anyway. By now, the origin story no longer feels like a single beginning at all. It feels like a long practice of carrying embers through wind and hoping there is enough dry grass ahead. You carry those embers forward, and by now, the path has become crowded with stories, records, monuments, genes, myths, and arguments, all trying to explain how humans came to be what they are. Then the old question takes a dramatic turn, because many cultures do not merely describe ancestors' floods, kings, or cities. They describe makers, creators, shapers, watchers, beings who form humans from clay breath, blood speech, dust, divine intention, or cosmic order. What's broadly accepted is that creator myths are central to human cultures and reflect worldview, identity, morality, and meaning rather than modern scientific accounts, but they are powerful enough that people keep trying to read them as hidden history anyway. Most historians agree that creation narratives vary widely across cultures, while often sharing themes such as order, emerging from chaos, humans, formed from earth, divine speech, sacred craft, or conflict among higher powers. The evidence we do have points to recurring symbolic patterns, not a single universal script. Archaeology suggests these stories emerge within specific social and ritual contexts shaped by environment politics, an inherited tradition, a desert society, a river civilization, a seafaring people, a pastoral community. All may imagine origins through different textures of life. You can feel that in the imagery itself. Mud and river water becoming human form, breath entering clay, a name spoken into being. a cosmic body divided into world and people, a divine artisan shaping order like a potter at work. These are not laboratory explanations. They are meaning maps. They tell you what the world is for, what humans are for, what obligations bind the living to the dead, the ruler to the people to the land, and everyone to the sky. Most historians agree that this is where creation stories carry social architecture, not just metaphysical speculation. One interpretation is that some maker figures in myth may encode memory of elite classes, culture heroes, foreign arrivals, or natural forces personified over time. That's a possibility, not a certainty, and it must be handled carefully. A careful reading might suggest that myths can preserve layered historical impressions without functioning as literal reports. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, then myth becomes a meeting point between memory and imagination rather than a puzzle box with one secret key. Historians still argue whether specific mythic motifs, spread mainly through contact and borrowing, or emerged independently, because human societies often ask similar questions in similar symbolic ways. That debate matters because parallel myths can feel spooky in a way that invites overreach. A more cautious explanation could be that both processes happen. People borrow stories, and people also invent similar symbolic structures under similar pressures. Human beings everywhere face birth, death, weather, hierarchy, labour, hunger and wonder. It would be surprising if no patterns overlapped. And now we reach the part that draws the brightest thumbnails. A fringe idea proposes that stories of divine makers, watchers or sky beings preserve literal memory of advanced non-human visitors who engineered humanity. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it remains popular because mythic language can sound technological when translated loosely and read through modern expectations. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. As a literal historical claim, the evidence is thin. Most historians agree creation myths are not best treated as coded genetics manuals. What if the story is pointing at something else? What if makers are not hidden engineers from the sky, but a human way of speaking about forces too large, intimate, or frightening to explain directly? If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, one interpretation is that creator figures can personify the experience of dependence itself. The river feeds you, the land shapes you, the ruler claims authority over you, the ancestors define you, the cosmos surrounds you. Myth gathers these pressures and gives them faces and voices. This does not make the stories trivial. It may make them more profound. Archaeology suggests many creation narratives were recited, inscribed or enacted in ritual settings tied to kingship temples, seasonal cycles, or communal identity. The evidence we do have points to these stories doing active work in society. They comfort, warn, unite, justify, and orient. A popular rumour claims that if you decode the oldest myths correctly, you can reconstruct a single hidden account of humanity's real engineered origin. This might support the idea that myths preserve deep memory in symbolic form, but as a direct decoding project, it is suggestive, not conclusive. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. Let me rephrase that more carefully. Myth may preserve traces of historical experience, social change and environmental memory, but it also transforms them through poetry, ritual and politics. That's a possibility, not a certainty in any one passage. We'll keep the solid ground separate from the mist. You can hear the setting as the story is told. Temple drums low in the distance, reed lamps flickering, incense and oil smoke hanging in the air, a reciter's voice trained to carry, children trying to stay awake, elders listening for familiar lines, a ruler or priest hearing legitimacy in the same words that a farmer hears as comfort. One story, many functions, human all the way through. Most historians agree that creator myths reveal less about biological origins in the scientific sense, and more about how societies understand personhood, order and obligation. The evidence we do have points to a deep truth that remains useful tonight. Humans do not only ask where we came from, we ask what kind of beings we believe ourselves to be. And often the answer arrives wrapped in symbol, because symbol can hold contradiction better than prose. As you step away from the ritual light, the old question still glows, but its edges are softer. The makers and watchers may not be literal engineers, yet they matter because they show how seriously people took the mystery of being human. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. We're not proving anything tonight. We're following clues, and the clue here is simple. Even when humans speak of gods, they're often also speaking about themselves. You step out of ritual light and into something much more familiar. Even if it wears ancient clothes, certainty performs with confidence. By now you have seen how humans preserve memory in bones, tools, caves, fields, cities, monuments, records, trade collapse and myth. And yet the question of origin still keeps attracting bold modern explanations with sharp edges and dramatic music. What's broadly accepted is that many contemporary pseudo-historical theories blend real archaeological sites, genuine open questions, and speculative leaps into a single story that feels complete long before the evidence is. And if you are tired, curious, or just deeply human, that kind of story can be very hard to resist. Most historians agree that public fascination with hidden history theories often grows in the gaps between specialist research and popular storytelling. Archaeology suggests that real uncertainty exists at the edges of many questions, but the evidence we do have points to a difference between uncertainty and anything goes speculation. That difference is the entire game tonight. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. You can almost see the modern scene as clearly as an ancient port. A glowing screen in a dark room, a thumbnail promising the truth they never told you, a voice speaking in perfect certainty over images of ruins, star symbols and slow zooms on carved stone. It feels thrilling because it offers a single thread through a messy past. No ambiguity, no maybe, no patient footnotes, just one hidden answer, unlocking everything from pyramids to genetics to myths to your weird cousin's late-night group chat. A more cautious explanation could be that the appeal has less to do with secret evidence and more to do with emotional design. One interpretation is that pseudo-history succeeds because it gives you narrative relief. It takes a complicated human past and compresses it into a clean plot with villains, gatekeepers and a reveal. That's a possibility, not a certainty for every viewer, but it fits a pattern historians and educators often notice. Complexity asks patience. Certainty asks only belief. Historians still argue whether the modern appetite for hidden origin stories is driven more by distrust of institutions, dissatisfaction with simplified schooling, media incentives, or the timeless human love of mystery. That debate matters because not all skepticism is bad. In fact, careful skepticism is essential. Most historians agree that questioning assumptions, revisiting old models, and testing evidence are normal parts of scholarship. The problem begins when questioning becomes a decorative word placed in front of conclusions chosen in advance. Archaeology suggests the strongest revisions come from new finds, better methods, and transparent debate, not from forcing every mystery into one pre-selected theory. What if the story is pointing at something else? What if the modern obsession with hidden origins reveals a very old human need, the need for meaning that feels personal? If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, then pseudo-history becomes less a sign of stupidity and more a sign of longing. A careful reading might suggest that people are not always asking for facts alone. They are asking to feel connected to a larger story, to feel that their life belongs to a pattern bigger than Bill's traffic, and finding where you left your charger. That longing is real. The trick is not to feed it bad evidence. A fringe idea proposes that mainstream archaeology systematically hides proof of a radically different human origin known only to insiders. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it remains popular because institutions are imperfect experts, disagree publicly, and genuine corrections in science can look to outsiders like instability. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. Broad claims of coordinated suppression across fields and countries are usually much weaker than they sound. Scholars continue to debate many details, yes, but debate is not the same thing as a cover-up. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. A popular rumour claims that if enough myths from different cultures sound similar, they must describe one literal global event or one literal hidden lineage. This might support the idea that humans share recurring symbolic patterns, or that stories travel farther than we assume. But as a one-key explanation, it is suggestive, not conclusive. Most historians agree that cultural parallels can emerge through contact-independent invention, and the simple fact that humans everywhere face birth, death, power, weather, and wonder. Let me rephrase that more carefully. Similarity is a clue, not a verdict. That's a possibility, not a certainty. We'll keep the solid ground separate from the mist. And here is the solid ground that matters most in this section. What's broadly accepted is that the scientific and historical picture of humanity is already astonishing without adding unsupported claims. Africa as the deep cradle of our species, migrations across changing worlds, symbolic art, agriculture, cities, writing, trade, mixing, collapse and reinvention, creator myths carrying meaning. None of this is small. The evidence we do have points to a story stranger and richer than the simple textbook version many people remember, which may be exactly why fringe stories find so much room to grow around it. You can feel the modern stakes in a small, ordinary scene. A parent explaining a documentary to a child. A student hearing nobody really knows, and taking that either as an invitation to learn or an excuse to believe anything. A creator deciding whether to use careful language or dramatic certainty, because dramatic certainty gets more clicks. Human origins, once again, are not only about the past. They are about who gets to shape meaning in the present. So you keep walking, carrying both curiosity and caution, which may be the healthiest pair of tools in this entire journey. Wonder is welcome. Questions are welcome. Imagination is welcome. But we're not proving anything tonight, we're following clues. And the clue here is simple. The strongest stories are not always the loudest ones. Sometimes the truer path is the one that keeps saying maybe, may, could, and still manages to leave you staring at the stars. You keep staring at the stars a little longer, because after everything you have walked through tonight, the oldest habit returns in the quiet. Firelight stone water fields, cities, records, myths, trade routes, ruins, and modern arguments all drift around the same question. And the question is still simple enough to fit inside a whisper. Where did you come from, really? Not only your family, not only your nation, not only your language, but your species, your way of making meaning, your strange human habit of turning evidence into story and story back into identity. What's broadly accepted is that archaeology, fossils, and genetics together give us an extraordinary, evidence-based account of human origins rooted in Africa and unfolding across deep time. And yet, as you have felt in every section, the edges remain open in important ways. Most historians agree that the mainstream story of human origins is strong on the big structure and still active in the details. Archaeology suggests early Homo sapiens emerged in Africa, dispersed in multiple waves, adapted across environments, developed symbolic behaviour, and gradually built more complex social worlds. The evidence we do have points to continuity and change braided together. That is already a remarkable answer, even before mystery enters the room. And mystery does enter but gently. One interpretation is that the enduring power of origin stories comes from the fact that evidence alone, while vital, does not satisfy every human need. A careful reading might suggest that we also want orientation, meaning, belonging, and a sense that our lives connect to something older than ourselves. That's a possibility, not a certainty, but it explains why myths, rumours, and hidden history theories keep rising around genuine archaeology, like mist around a river at dawn. Historians still argue whether some key transitions in prehistory were driven more by environmental pressure, social learning, population density, or cultural innovation, and those debates are not flaws in the field, but signs of a living discipline. That matters, because by now you can probably feel the difference between honest uncertainty and dramatic certainty. Honest uncertainty says, here is what the evidence supports, here is what remains debated, and here is where interpretation begins. Dramatic certainty says, I have one final answer that solves everything, and also somehow fits neatly into a thumbnail. One of these approaches tends to survive better under scrutiny. The other tends to survive better under loud music. Most historians agree that the true origin of humanity is not a single hidden fact waiting to be unveiled in a basement vault. What's broadly accepted is that it is a long, layered story assembled from many kinds of evidence, revised when new evidence appears, and always interpreted by humans who bring their own assumptions to the work. The evidence we do have points to something both humbling and beautiful. Your species is old, adaptive, collaborative, symbolic, and deeply mixed. You come from movement. You come from memory. You come from survival and reinvention. A fringe idea proposes that one day a discovery will overturn everything and reveal a completely different engineered origin for humanity. This theory isn't widely accepted, but if we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it still reminds us of something useful. Science and history remain open to new evidence. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. Right now, the strongest evidence does not support those sweeping claims. This raises the possibility that the biggest future discoveries may refine the story more than replace it. What if the story is pointing at something else? What if the deepest truth of human origin is not hidden behind the evidence, but inside the way you respond to it? You gather clues, you compare stories, you imagine possibilities, you revise, you argue, you pass the question forward. One interpretation is that the origin story is also a mirror showing what kind of thinkers we become when faced with uncertainty. That's a possibility, not a certainty, but tonight it feels close. A popular rumour claims there is a single ancient source text somewhere that, if found, would finally settle every debate about where humans came from. This might support the idea that people long for closure more than complexity, but as evidence, it is suggestive, not conclusive. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. And maybe, just maybe, that is part of why the question stays alive. A fully closed mystery gives you answers. A living mystery gives you a relationship. Let me rephrase that more carefully. We are not saying anything could be true. That's a possibility, not a certainty, and it is usually not helpful. We're saying the strongest path is to hold wonder and discipline together. We'll keep the solid ground separate from the mist. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. So now the pace softens. You are back by a fire in a way, even if tonight your fire is just a small light in a quiet room, or the glow of a screen slowly dimming as the hour grows late. The wind has eased. The questions are still there, but they no longer need to be solved before sleep. You have walked from Africa's deep beginnings through migration paths and stone tools, through painted caves and planted fields, through cities, flood memories, DNA monuments, writing trade, collapse, and creator myths, all the way to the modern hunger for certainty. And through it all, the same pattern keeps returning. Humans observe, humans imagine, humans remember, humans tell. The story of your origin is not smaller because it remains partly open. It may be larger, it may be kinder to the evidence, and kinder to your own mind to let the unanswered edges stay soft for a while. Most historians agree that the broad shape is clear even while details continue to sharpen. Archaeology suggests that the human past is real, traceable, and astonishing. The evidence we do have points to a long continuity of hands' voices and shared attention reaching across time toward you. So let the old arguments drift a little now. Let the loud claims quiet down. Let the monuments sink back into dusk. The tablets cool in their shelves. The river settle, the cave walls darken. The fields rustle in night air. Let the stars remain what they have always been for us, both map and mystery. You do not need one final hidden answer tonight. You only need the gentle truth that you belong to a species that kept going, kept learning, kept telling stories under uncertain skies, and somehow carried enough light forward for you to be here listening. And as the last embers dim, you can rest in that. Not certainty, not confusion, but a calm place between them where curiosity stays awake just long enough to smile and then finally goes quiet.